And thank you everyone for joining. For those of you who may know me already, my name is Jeff Heiser. I'm the founder of Polaris Athlete, and we're an emerging edtech platform for high school student athletes navigating NIL in preparation for college admissions. So we are integrating NIL education into college counseling practices through our work, of which it's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce Bill Carter today and share Bill's background a little bit and kick this meeting off and allow Bill to take over from there. But for the past year and a half or so, I've had the distinct privilege of being able to sit in and participate in probably 4 or 5 of Bill's NIL leadership cohorts, which is a really unique experience in the sense that Bill leads these leadership cohorts via Student Athlete Insights, in which he's bringing in guest speakers to come in and present and share their industry knowledge and expertise. And these are CEOs, founders, vice presidents, professors, some of which are athletic directors, and then other elements of the NIL ecosystem, law, finance, and other various sectors. So it's been a really unique experience to be able to participate and contribute, as well as from a learning opportunity. I was able to connect those dots and see the overlap in which our work as college counselors and school counselors fits very much with the silver lining of NIL and all of the positives in which NIL brings to the equation here. So it's something in which us as educators, as school counselors and college counselors alike, I really feel as though it's already our work that we've been doing for our careers. And so now it's just a matter of connecting those dots and putting the resources in front of these students and families as they navigate this transformative time of their life. With that being said, my background is in school counseling. I still identify as a school counselor, and I had the opportunity to build a college counseling program early in my career, in which I took the jump from school counseling to college counseling at that point in time. And since then, along the ways, I've always worked independently, mostly pro bono, with families navigating college admissions, specifically student athlete recruitment and everything along those lines. And it's just over the past year and a half, 2 years, where I really noticed that many of our families were coming to us in regards to the NIL side of this conversation first, before the college admissions, before the athletic recruitment even. And, you know, initially I felt as though these families were putting the cart before the horse. But now with the career readiness and outcomes and all the opportunities to link it directly with all the self-discovery work that we do as counselors, I felt that it was our time to really kind of come to the table as leaders in the industry and begin having these conversations with families to be able to best guide them through this chapter of their life in a way that has a connection piece with long-term success and positive outcomes far beyond anything in terms of short-term deals and college admissions and athletic placement and stuff of that nature. So today I'm really excited to introduce Bill Carter, who's not only a great friend, but also a partner in regards to building this edtech product that we're creating over at Polaris Athlete Hub. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it to Bill here.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm excited to have this discussion on a Friday afternoon. Very quickly, a little bit about my background. I've spent 25 years in sports marketing, mainly on the professional athlete side, doing NIL work before it was called NIL. And in 2019, I sold my interest in a sports marketing agency that I was a co-founder of and operated for about 20 years. That agency is called Fuse. Today, or in 2019, early 2020, I created an organization called Student Athlete Insights, and that now sort of does 2 things. I do some consulting for brands and universities and professional service providers, and I also operate something called the NILforum, which is a professional community for those that are in any way involved in NIL or seek to be involved in NIL. And that entity does three things on a monthly basis. It provides expert speakers that do live webinars. It provides a monthly proprietary NIL data report from a research poll that I do that has about 5,000 current college student athletes and about 1,000 high school prospects that I survey every month. And then there's the sort of networking that happens within the forum. When I'm not operating the forum, I'm working on behalf of brands, helping them find their way into NIL, or working with state high school athletic associations, or working with universities. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. I know that a number of you have had the opportunity to listen to Jeff's presentations prior to today's at various events. I feel like Jeff is on a world tour these days, calling me from various airports. And of course, I've reviewed Jeff's materials prior to our conversation today. I'm not going to repeat a lot of information. I am going to touch on a couple of things in terms of the foundational elements, but then I really want to get to the part in the storyline where we are helping student athletes in the most genuine form of NIL. And I'm going to describe what that is in a few minutes. But let's jump to a little bit of the foundational aspect to this. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to frame up for those of you who have seen Jeff previously, but maybe haven't thought a lot about NIL since. A couple of things I just want to cover or reiterate. When we talk about NIL, we're talking really about the right of publicity, the right of a student athlete in this case, to control their name, image, and likeness for commercial purposes. It's primarily a state law. It varies by state, but it all sort of ladders up to the same principle, which is whether you're a student athlete or you're not a student athlete, you have the right to control this aspect under publicity rights. The next thing I want to mention to you is that when I have a conversation about high school age NIL or collegiate NIL or any particular aspect or niche within the space, I always try to take a step back and say to participants like you, attendees like you, that hardly ever do things happen in NIL in a vacuum. They almost always happen in a way that's affecting or impacting a range of the entities within the NIL ecosystem. So the 30 of us or so today having this conversation are obviously very focused on the high school age student athlete. But a lot of what we know about NIL, or a lot of what we need to prepare for and prepare student athletes in NIL, can happen elsewhere. And so I think it's important for you to have a decent sort of baseline understanding, and you're not going to get a lot of it from me today. There's too many places on this graphic, but it's important, I think, you have a baseline understanding of all the aspects of the ecosystem so that you're also not operating in a vacuum when you're providing advice to a young person. So we're talking about regulations, the role of institutions, whether that's a high school, a state athletic association, a university, the student athletes themselves, and that's mainly where we're going to focus today, NIL collectives or NIL clubs, marketplaces, service providers like attorneys, financial advisors, agents, those entities, the brands, where we're also going to spend some time today, and then media involvement of the NIL marketplace. So one of the last things I want to say from a foundational aspect is that, we, not necessarily those who probably care more about it, like you as attendees here today, and Jeff and I, we don't necessarily conflate various aspects of NIL But I think out there in the general population and even the media, there is a conflation of terms that aren't all necessarily NIL. There's a lot of gray in this. But so I want to be clear about what we're talking about today and really what we're not talking about. So in 2026, there's three forms of NIL that sort of like all get sort of mashed together. There's brand partnerships, which I would call the most genuine part of NIL. Student athletes promoting a product or service in exchange for compensation. And that's mainly what we're going to talk about today. This kind of NIL is permitted at between 85 and 90% of states across the country. We'll talk more about that in a moment. There's collective NIL, so NIL that where the opportunity is generated by an NIL collective. And for those of you who don't know, an NIL collective is really a booster organization that's a third party created to support student athletes on a specific campus. The example I'm using here is Happy Valley United, which is Penn State's NIL collective. All collectives, 100% of collectives are prohibited at the high school level, regardless of state. I shouldn't even say it that way. Every state that is permitted NIL, those 85% of states that have permitted NIL, have still prohibited the development and activation of collectives to support those student athletes. So that's completely off the table, that type of NIL. And then there's the third kind that some would say is not really NIL. And actually, that statement is false. It's not entirely correct. Revenue sharing, that term, is really in reference to the direct payment of college student athletes from Division I schools as a result of what's called the House settlement, or House versus NCAA, which enabled the payments of about $2.8 billion in back pay to student athletes that have participated for the last 10 years. And going forward, the payment of $20.5 million to the Division I athletes whose institutions have opted into this settlement. So when I hear people say, well, that's not NIL, that's true and false. It's mostly true, but in some instances, the institutions themselves have created NIL relationships with their student athletes in exchange for that payment. Now, in a lot of cases, in most cases, the university is not requiring that those student athletes do any promotional work to receive compensation. But in some cases they are. So it can take the form of legitimate NIL. Okay. The last thing I want to say about this upfront section, sort of setting the stage, is that you wouldn't be on this call if you weren't interested in this topic. And I think we'll be proven, the group on this call and Jeff and I will be proven to have been on the sort of right side of history. And it may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, but NIL is it is a reality. That this sort of toothpaste is not going back in the bottle, regardless of who might want it to go that way. Not going to happen. And among the many reasons, legal and otherwise, that it's not going to happen, that we're not going to go back, is that there's public support for this. So this data in front of you is actually a couple of years old now, about 18 months old. The Knight Commission, Elon University, the Povich Center of Sports Journalism at University of Maryland in connection with the Washington Post have all done public sentiment research around NIL and NIL support. And it's largely supported for college student athletes. It's over the 50% mark. Again, this is 18 months old. It's probably closer to 60% now for high school athletes. And even at the youth sports level, the number is somewhere now between 40 and 50% support. So we're on the right side of this. I don't think we can, I don't think our support can be blind support. We have to be careful and consider what we're doing and the steps we're taking and the support we're giving young people. But there's public sentiment that says that this is all going actually in the right direction. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the opportunities, and then I want to talk about how student athletes can capitalize on those opportunities. So when it comes to the opportunities themselves, whether we look at this collectively or whether we segment out to the college space and the high school space, we sort of end up at the same place, which is that right now, NIL is largely a function of social media influencer marketing. That's where the opportunity is. So if you're a young person and you want to test an NIL activity, you want to be involved, it probably is going to mean that you're involved in some sort of social media engagement on behalf of a brand or a small business. So there are other opportunities, and I never dissuade young people from testing those opportunities. This is really intended to show you that it's most likely that those early opportunities are going to be social media in nature. And what does that look like? That looks like being what a young person mainly associates with being a social media influencer. Don't let your mind wander too far to think of, that means that you have hundreds of thousands of followers and so forth. That's actually not the case at all. You can be an effective content creator, social media follower with 1,000 fans or followers to your social media pages. So the scale is not necessarily important. The scale sort of takes care of itself in a lot of ways. The businesses tend to be small. The follower count tends to be small, and so forth. So, but in terms of the activity itself, that's really what I want to get across to you, that this is largely a social media endeavor. Okay, a lot of the questions I get to, or I guess maybe the pushback, and I hear this from both administrators in the college space and in the high school space, which is, isn't this really just a football thing, or isn't this really just a football and basketball thing? And the answer is no. And again, like I always say when I pull a slide up like this, I mean, I guess there's ways, it depends on how you want to describe a data point like this. You can say, well, look how dominant football is. Well, yeah, I mean, our country is in love with football. Football players are going to get the most opportunities. The other way to look at this slide, and it is also the truth, which is that nearly 60% of all NIL activity is not football related. And there is really no second, third, fourth most dominant sport. I mean, clearly basketball, women's and men's does well, volleyball, baseball, and then you see a lot of other sports at that 2%, 3% level. But it just means that there are a lot of student athletes who can be involved if they choose to be involved. Okay, so that's the background stuff. Let's jump to what I think you need to know about brand partnerships, that first and most genuine kind of NIL. So I think the first thing you ought to know is that sort of answering the question, why do brands get involved? Why do brands, and when I say brand, it can be a big brand, like at least two of them here. It can be a medium brand like Roback. It can be a small business in your town. They all really operate. It's going to sound like this isn't true, but trust me, it's true. I've spent a lot of time in marketing in my career. They're operating on the same principles, the same principles of visibility and consumer engagement. So it starts with how much visibility is NIL and a partnership with a student athlete going to give my brand. It all starts with visibility, but there's more to it than that. There ought to be more to it than that. And there usually is, once you sort of peel back that first layer of and identify what the brand is really trying to achieve. So the three most common reasons that brands get involved after visibility are they're trying to get to a new market, they're innovating in some way, or having a relationship with a student athlete provides them some sort of competitive advantage. I'm not going to go into these case studies right now. You're going to have a copy of this presentation, and you know, of course, you can read more about it then. But these are just examples of really the three most common reasons beyond visibility for a brand or small business to get involved in an athlete partnership. Okay, so if you haven't really haven't paid much attention up to this point, and you're gonna go get a cup of coffee in 10 minutes before we're even done, I'll wave my hands and say, this is the most important page, probably, maybe not the most interesting, but the most important page in this presentation. This is the brand roadmap or the small business roadmap prior to, during, and after a student athlete is engaged by that brand or business, okay? And I think this is the most important page because it helps you help a student athlete understand that the process doesn't start when they get a DM from a local business or they walk into a small business and get that business to agree to consider NIL. There's work that is done that a young person needs to know in order to be successful at any of this. Okay, so we could spend 15 minutes on that. I'm not going to do that to you, but I do want to spend a minute or two just walking through the steps and illustrating what each means. So the first step is that unless the student athlete has initiated the contact and the business has no idea even what NIL is, we should assume that the business knows what NIL is and they've done some sort of competitive, if they're being proactive, they've done some sort of competitive analysis. In other words, they've decided, hey, we want to get a young person, a young student athlete to be a representative of ours. Are there any student athletes that we might contact, and are there other businesses like ours already doing this activity? So some level of competitive analysis. The second thing they do is that they determine what the athlete is going to do. In other words, they're not signing athletes and then figuring that out. They're figuring out what the activation is prior to signing an athlete so they can actually implement a plan. Third, they're developing a criteria that helps them select an athlete, so they could do it by gender, school, sport, social following, those sorts of criteria. They determine the compensation. Are they going to give the athlete cash, product, discount, some sort of access to an event, tickets, things like that? You know, what is the compensation going to be? It's not always cash. They're going to acquire the student athlete. In other words, they're going to either direct message them, they're going to use a digital marketplace to find athletes. If it's in the college space, they're going to go through a collective. If they try to do that at the high school space, you and everybody else is going to shut it down because it's not allowed. But that's part of the acquisition process. Once that athlete is in the fold, they're going to train that athlete on what they want the athlete to do. This is really I think, the beginnings of a really important part of NIL, which is the professional development of young people in the NIL space. This is where, the NIL, the student athletes already at this point had an opportunity to engage with a set of adults about a business relationship. They've reviewed a contract. They're already involved. They've signed that agreement with a guardian or parent. And now they're into sort of this training mode where they're learning the expectations of a business that they're going to have to complete in order to be compensated. And then the last piece is that business or brand is monitoring the activities of the partnership, and through that they're tracking whether this is going to be a successful campaign or not. Okay, there's a lot there. Happy to talk more about that or answer questions about that later. So, you would think that of all of what I just described, the most time-consuming or exciting part for the brand, or most important part for the brand side of this equation, is a lot of that upfront stuff, the acquisition of the athletes, the training of the athletes, those sorts of things. But in essence, none of that actually matters a whole lot in whether this is going to be successful from their side. And from their side, the success lives or dies around sponsor activation. Brand activation is what we'll call it. So for the brand, promoting their relationship with the athlete is the most important thing. If that doesn't get done by the brand and by the athlete, this fails, and they won't do it again. The brand won't do it again. So the most important thing is promoting that relationship between the brand and the athlete. So after the company has signed an agreement, that activation process begins. Again, it's probably written weeks or months before the athlete is brought on, but it is initiated when a campaign begins, when the relationship really kicks off. So companies typically have 4 elements to a brand activation campaign. They'll usually try to include things like an online activation, and that of course fits nicely into that stat I gave you earlier, that 85% of all NIL activity is social media. That's the online piece. On air, if there's some sort of broadcast element, even if it's a small business that does local television advertising, they could use that student athlete on air in a broadcast commercial way. At live events and at a retail store, a retail event of some type. But again, of the 4, it's that online piece, and more specifically the social media piece, that's the most important. But I think it's important for you on the call today to know that there are often as many as 4 ways to activate that relationship. Okay. So let's move from the brand side, where the student athlete wants to end up and where you may want to help them end up, to sort of the action plan for how a student athlete gets there. And certainly in a presentation and a discussion like we're having here that's under an hour, I'm hitting the broad brushstrokes. There are a lot of incremental steps in each of these, but I want to hit on what I think are the absolute 3 most important elements to this going forward. Okay, so I break it down into 3 things that every student athlete has to be doing if they intend to engage in NIL, whether it's as a high schooler or when they get to a college campus. So number 1 is they need to work on building a personal brand. And I know everybody on this call, We all hear the term personal brand so much, it begins to sound cliche and an easy thing to ignore. There's a real component to this, and it really does make a difference. And I'm going to show you some data that proves that out. It really does make a difference when it comes to NIL. When we're talking about a personal brand, we're talking about the perception we have of a person, what we know about the person's background, their successes, their failures, their values. Notice, I do not use the word athletics or sports in this definition. Clearly, that's baked in here, but it's not the only thing. It's not the only thing that matters in building a personal brand for the purpose of NIL. And where we see this is in the likelihood that an individual student athlete gets a deal or doesn't get a deal or gets multiple deals. So the student athletes who feature characteristics in addition to their sport are 12 times more likely to secure NIL activities, NIL partnerships. Why? Well, it's sort of obvious, right? By talking about things, or rather building into your personal brand, things in addition to your sport, you broaden your appeal, you differentiate yourself, and you therefore increase your marketability. That can only be done by way of going through a relatively formal personal brand building process. And this is where I sort of really, really summarize in just a very short way something that, again, is we could easily talk about for 30 minutes. But the building your brand in 3 steps really comes down to 3 things. We need to see from the brand side that we need to understand what your strengths are. We need to see what your values are, and we need to see what your interests are. Those 3 things, your strengths, your values, your interests, when you pull those into your personal brand, and the example would be, when I say pull them in, show us you care about those things on your social media. Show us you care about those things in your life outside of sports. When you can give us the detail, what your strengths are, what your values are, what your interests are, when we see those, that is building a strong brand, and you're going to have far more success, 12 times more success, identifying and landing NIL opportunities. Okay, number 2. The second step is really establishing NIL-centric social media. And I know it's sort of jarring to see this, because I think me and probably everybody else on this call is thinking, gosh, are we really gonna, push more social media onto kids? And the answer is no. The intent of this is not to suggest that young people should be spending more time on social media. It's actually probably somewhat the opposite of that. It's saying, if you're going to be on social media and you care about NIL, then hone in on content and a process that actually links up with your NIL goals, not just scrolling on TikTok for 2 hours every day, right? So that's really what this is. It's establishing NIL-centric social media so that brands can find you, and so that when you work on behalf of brands, on behalf of businesses, it makes sense what you're doing to promote that brand or service. So how do we go about that? Well, first we understand what brands want from social media, right? The brand wants that student athlete to engage, to increase their awareness, to see that the student athlete has great follower growth, if not a raw number on day one that's very high. The business is trying to identify leads and ultimately drive sales. And so knowing that this is what a brand or small business wants can help a student athlete with changing, editing, and defining what their NIL-centric social media is going to be. Okay, how do we get there? There's three things that I think every student athlete who is interested in NIL needs to know about social media. One is they need to know who their followers are. I know that sort of comes out of left field, but the first thing a brand or small business is going to ask a young person is, who are your followers? I see you have 3,000 followers. Who are they? You know, how many are in this local market? How many are back home if you're at a boarding school or something? What's your ability to create on brand, meaning your personal brand content? Do you talk about your community interests? Do you talk about your values? Do you talk about things other than your sport? And is all of that still on brand for you? And then ultimately, a brand or a small business wants that person to engage with their audience, not just post and walk away, but engage with their fans and followers. Okay. Last but not least, number 3 on supporting student athletes and getting them headed in the right direction is that they need to learn to market themselves. And again, if this sounds like professional development, it 100% is. This has almost nothing to do with NIL, but it's easy to pull it back into an NIL context. There's no such thing as a passive NIL opportunity. It is going to all be done through a student athlete's direct outreach. And I don't want to say it never happens, but it happens only about 1 out of every 10 times. Can an athlete sit back and expect that they're going to be contacted by a local business? It almost always works in the reverse. So we need to teach young people who are interested in NIL how to do that outreach, how to prepare and do that outreach through email or social media or mutual connections in person. So 3 steps to get there. They need to identify local businesses. They need to be able to craft effective communication. And they need to understand that, this dirty word that nobody wants to say, sales, this is a sales process, and sales doesn't work unless it's done consistently. So we need to help them do outreach consistently. Again, I'm not going to go through the list here. You're going to have a copy of this presentation, but I always like to leave an audience like this with some tools to help a young person to identify local businesses and brands that they might not otherwise be thinking of. So ranging from, of course, Google and Yelp to a Chamber of Commerce, LinkedIn, Instagram, all those sorts of things. Okay, so just one comment on the future, and then I want to open it up to if there are any questions. So I always think, I think in these presentations, it's good to, consider what is coming around the corner. I think in the near term, there's only a handful of states. I'm not even sure that I even updated this slide. It's only a handful of states that currently prohibit all forms of NIL. And so we're just under 51, the 50 states in Washington, D.C., but we're going to be at a place where all NIL is permitted in all states in the country very soon. I suspect probably by the end of 26 or beginning of 2027. Number 2, I think that one of the changes that's happening that people, it won't necessarily change the day-to-day, but it does change, I think, how we describe certain youth sports, high school sports, is that behind the scenes, I'm already seeing the definition of amateurism change. So amateurism in the past was essentially not being paid in any form, playing for the love of the game. Amateurism by 2027, 2028 is really going to mean you're not being paid to participate on the field, but that you can earn income regardless of your age off the field. And I think it's an important sort of distinction to make. And then the third thing I'd say, very much in your world, I'm imagining, is that a lot of what we've talked about in the last 35 minutes is already moving at warp speed on the club sports side, because there's little regulation there, right? And clubs are not required to follow the rules of a state high school athletic association. So don't be surprised if a lot of what we're describing here is already happening at the club level, or happens more quickly than is happening at the state high school athletic association level. Okay, so that's what I have for you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it so much. I want to sneak a quick question in here just because of some previous conversations I had this past week with several families, of which this week, for whatever reason alone, I might have had 5 to 6 families that I met with in which these kids, just social media wasn't something in which was a priority for them. In fact, they were completely off social media altogether. They've completely avoided it, and they're fascinating, awesome kids. They're doing incredible things in their community. They're open to the idea of building this out, but it does seem so daunting in the sense of, how do I get from 0 to 1,000, from 1,000 to 5,000, and so on and so forth. And these are individual kids. Some are sophomores in high school. Others are preparing to enroll at their Division I institutions next year. Where would you advise those particular families and those particular student athletes in regards to just getting started with that aspect as it pertains to social media?
Right. So, and just to clarify, you're saying that even though they've been off social media up to this point,
right,
they're willing to sort of get on it for the purpose of what we're describing here. They're
right,
ready to get on it, basically.
Exactly. And I've framed up the conversation for them through the lens of, this is your way to outreach and show the work that you've been doing thus far.
That's right.
Almost as that, that portfolio piece that's meeting them, in that social category as it relates to the usage of everything. But I think from a follower count standpoint, for them anyways, it feels overwhelming because they've lived in the horse and buggy era, and they feel as though this is a sports car game. So that's where they're feeling a little overwhelmed in that sense.
Yeah. So, I guess it starts with just the sort of the mental side of the game, which is, don't get caught up in the numbers. And I know young people have been sort of been told repeatedly, when it comes to social media and social media influencer marketing and content creation, that it's all about follower count. But first of all, there's no quick way to get there. You're not going to go from 0 to 1,000 overnight. It could very likely, you could get from 0 to 1,000 over the course of a year. And that is, I think you have to sort of set reasonable expectations in place. But I would start with one other thing, Jeff, which is, follower count should not be the goal. It just should not be the goal. So it's like, I wouldn't even write it down that you're going to try to go to 0 to 1,000 in a year, or get to 3,000 by the time you graduate high school and are playing your sport in college. The goal is simply to engage with your audience on social media with content that you are proud of and is in line with your strengths and your values and your interests. And if there are 300 people following you, so be it. And when there are 3,000 people following you, so be it too. You cannot make the follower count the goal. The goal is to create content on social media, that is representative of you and that you are proud of. And if you do that, then you will always find brands that share those same interests, values, and strengths. And when they see that alignment with you, they're willing to partner with you regardless of how many followers. And I just want to say one social media specific thing, because I know probably a lot of you, I hope, believe what I just said. But for those of you who don't believe what I just said is true, I'll just remind everybody that the algorithms are not, 2020, 2015 algorithms. So I can have 1,000 followers on TikTok. I can create a video that could be seen by 60,000 people, right? And that's not an extreme example. It happens all the time. In other words, we're not anchored by fans and followers. We are anchored by reach, which we can control by the quality of the content, regardless of how many people have, quote, signed up with us and become a fan or follower. So we just have to take that whole thing out of the equation.
Yeah, and I feel as though, would you say LinkedIn would be a better place for them to start organically from square one in that sense? Because everyone, for the most part, from a peer perspective, everyone is starting fresh there, as opposed to other social media accounts where kids may have 5, 6, 7+ years of growth already.
Yeah. Well, so I like, I'm a believer in LinkedIn for a lot of reasons for young people and NIL, mainly because it's the digital resume that we all share out in the real working world. And so they should have one too, right? And there's no doing that too early. And they also need to be on LinkedIn because it's their vehicle to find brands and businesses, identify the staff that work at those places, and have a mechanism to communicate to those people. But I don't necessarily see, so that's what LinkedIn's for. LinkedIn's not really for sharing information with your peers, right? So a brand is not going to, Jeff, they're not going to reach out to a high school lacrosse player and say, I want you to create content and put it on LinkedIn, because they know so few kids are on LinkedIn, right?
Right. Absolutely. Gabe, do you have a question?
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to say, Bill, spot on, 100%. As a former Division I athlete at Vanderbilt, someone who actually donates to the Vanderbilt Collective, and someone who has tried to hire some Vanderbilt athletes for some things. I mean, you're preaching gospel. My question to you is this: when I coach my, any student or student athlete, when I'm always preaching to them, you are the brand, right? Every post you like is getting scrutinized. I look at some student athletes, and some things that they like didn't agree with my message, so I passed over them. But my question for you is, are we also educating the parents? Because I know that they can cost student athletes deals just by the way they interact with their kids on social media, or because I'm researching them too, because ultimately I don't want my company to be attached with a bad message, right? So my question to you is, do you think that we should start to educate parents on, hey, this is how you need to be interacting on social media? You need to be thinking the same way. I have to protect my child's brand, so I need to be mindful of the post I like, the post that I make. What are your thoughts around that, Bill?
So first of all, Gabe, thank you for being so supportive with your opening comments. And
Spot on, man.
Jeff has probably heard me say this before, but I love Vanderbilt so much. That's for another day.
Go Doors.
I spent a week on that campus many years ago. Unbelievable place. That is truly a dream destination. So my short answer, but with the most enthusiasm I can have, is that 100% yes. Every opportunity that you get to address the family with or without the student athlete at the same time. But every opportunity to address the family, you should take. Because I would say, Gabe, if I was like, if I was assessing who could pass an NIL 101 test, I would say maybe 60% of high school athletes, maybe not high school students, but 60% of high school athletes could probably pass an elementary level test. True or false? Tell me what's true or false about NIL, right? I bet you that number is under 50% for parents. So the kids are closer. They're more informed. They're not anywhere near as informed as they need to be, but they've got a fighting chance because they care about it. They pay attention. The families, I think, tend to be significantly less educated. And think about it, the only time they ever hear about NIL is when they're reading about, say a Vanderbilt quarterback or something, who's in the transfer portal, how he got there and what he made, and maybe a big brand deal with another Power 4 athlete, those sorts of things. And if that's all you know about NIL, when they connect with somebody like you, like think about what their frame of reference is. It is so distorted from much of what you experience and much of what we've talked about here today. Like all of this stuff is out of their line of sight. So I'm 100% in your camp that educating families every chance you get is a big deal.
Gotcha. Appreciate you, Bill. Appreciate you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Bill, I'm going to jump back and think from a system standpoint in regards to just how fast this NIL industry does evolve. You're speaking to college counselors today. We know speed because admissions, it evolves super quickly, but it pales in comparison to how quickly the evolutionary life cycle is in NIL and how fast things do change. So my question here actually is more in alignment with, in regards to high school specifically, for those that do take a proactive approach here and they get NIL education right, because it is such a fast moving environment. What do you see as the benefits in the next 1 to 2 years for those that do get it right versus those that are still perhaps sitting on the sideline in 12 to 18 months from now?
Yeah. So I guess, Jeff, there's not a direct line or conclusion we can draw in every case from what we have viewed or studied in the college space to the high school space. Everything's not applicable, everything's not relevant, but some things are. And my perspective is that the universities and colleges that jumped out, got involved in NIL very early, they tended to be resource-rich institutions. They could afford to make some mistakes, and many of them did. And then there were some schools that came, but they figured it out because they had the resources to do it. Then there were some universities that came a little bit later. They avoided some early pitfalls, right? And maybe they set up their structure more efficiently. They educated their athletes more efficiently. They brought in the right kind of service providers or platforms more efficiently. And I think there's something to be said for that not to be the first mover, but maybe to be like not long after. And that's where I actually think we are in the high school space. Like I'll just use sort of, maybe like the obvious example, because I don't think they're represented here on the phone, but like, if you were IMG, sure, you could come out of the gate fast on day one, right? Because you could afford to make mistakes. And I think they have made them. And I think they've changed even structurally how they deal with NIL and NIL education. But now I think we're at that phase where it is the right time for high schools to really begin to take this seriously, and learn sort of from the lessons. I think mostly about the lesson of like the timing of all of this.
Mhm.
Like the high schools today, they're not the ones who are engaged in this conversation. They're not behind. Probably shouldn't wait 2 more years either, though.
Right.
Probably the time is about now to put those pieces in place, whether it's structure or staff or education or tools. The time is now to do those things. Now, meaning today for the next, year and a half, today through the end of 2027.
Right. And jumping over to the college side here, and feel free to interrupt me if anyone else has a question, but I'm thinking of Brittany Willett, who's the president of the Sun Angel Collective at Arizona State. And Brittany recently shared that she's starting, her and her team are starting to identify that these talent development pipelines are naturally occurring between student athletes and brands that are partnering with their student athletes at Arizona State. And they're hiring these kids. And I see it as, it's low risk, high reward in terms of, the last 2 stops on your roadmap there in regards to training and then the ROI. There's nothing more visible than the ROI that you do create via these NIL brand activations and the partnerships that are occurring here. So in terms of just framing that conversation and having that conversation earlier in the pipeline with high school student athletes, I'm curious as to what your take would be on in terms of what advantages, both from a college completion standpoint as well as career success, would schools that are, making a priority here want to invest in something like this for their student athletes, and even beyond student athletes, because as we know, NIL doesn't stop with just student athletes. It's not exclusive, So for those kids that are potentially, passionate about something else, how does that NIL education, how can that, what can we measure there in terms of long-term advantages, would you say?
So I'll point to a different third party as I think confirmation that what you're describing, the timing and the emphasis, is spot on. So some attendees on the call might know of a company named Learfield. Learfield is the largest company in the US that manages multimedia rights for college campuses. They own the rights to practically every big name university that plays big time sports that you watch on TV, right? They manage the athletic departments and the multimedia rights for Michigan, Ohio State, Texas, on and on, that level of schools. So you would think that they'd care about nothing but football and basketball when it comes to NIL, but that's actually not the case. Learfield's entire NIL platform, in addition to supporting football and basketball, is really pointed towards professional development. Why? Because they know that 95% of the NIL deals that come down the pike, particularly those that go to non-revenue sport athletes, are going to be an experience for the student athlete that goes beyond compensation and provides experience for that student athlete that they'd never be able to get in a different context, because they can't get internships because they're playing their sport, and on, all the reasons that student athletes have a different life once they get to those campuses. So I think what you're describing is in a large way already being sort of realized and enacted at some of the biggest campuses in the country for all athletes, not just revenue sport athletes.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bill. If anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in here. Otherwise, we'll conclude today's session here. Bill, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and stopping over, and for everyone else signing on. Appreciate it going into the holiday weekend. Next month, Friday, May 1st, we'll be revisiting for part 2 of our professional development series with Katie Robinson, who's an 11-time All-American swimmer at the University of Texas, and then she went on to have a really stellar coaching career, and her most recent stop of which was as the associate head coach at Stanford University. So Katie's going to be diving into the recruiting aspects and the adjusted timelines that we're all certainly experiencing when we're working with student athletes today. But Bill, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
Great to be here. Thanks, everybody.